Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I grew up in a relatively white, middle class, you could say, suburb of Brighton, a town called Lewes. People of Lewes will hate it that I've called it a suburb of Brighton, but effectively it is. And I could have lived my life as a child, never really interacting with people of different faiths, never really interacting and learning about different kind of family units. I grew up in a family of a mum and a dad who were married before I was born and remain married now. But the reason that I understand that there are different family units, that there are people of different religions, is from the very get-go at school, we read books and we were told stories about different families. And when the school was going to introduce a book about a child who was maybe Muslim, they didn't call an all-parents meeting to consult and ask, we're going to be introducing a book of which will introduce a character this semester, this term, that might not quite look like the kind of characters that you see every day in Lewes. No, the school got on with it. And parents accepted it because there was leadership shown, of course, not by, just by schools, but by many people in the community, that that was the right thing to do. So when we're introducing rather mundane books, many of these stories and educational methods are pretty mundane. You know, about a mermaid or about two penguins or whatever the particular story is. They're not actually that exciting. To be honest, when we're introducing them, do I expect a head teacher to have to call an all-parent assembly to consult on that particular fiction book that's going to be introduced, that is at the right reading level and, of course, is generally appropriate for those children? No, I don't. And actually, I think it's rather dangerous if we kind of expect that to be the basis of how teachers have to teach. Every time they want to introduce something new, they're going to teach about biology or they're going to teach arithmetic this month rather than just equations, that they call an all-school assembly. No, I think that would be ridiculous. And I think that is the approach that we need to be treating this kind of issue. It is about talking about all different kinds of ways the world works, through storytelling, through narrative telling, and not telling the individuals of what goes in and what goes out, but actually about what love means. And actually that is also important for keeping our children safe. Because if children are not taught about what appropriate relationships are, if they're not taught about what friendships mean, compared to what loving relationships mean, what a relationship between adults means, differently to relationships between children, if you're not taught some of those basic facts, what you actually do is allow our children to be vulnerable to predators, either at that young age or later on in life. And that I will give way.
He's making a really excellent speech and making a really excellent point. And my daughter's just come back from school because the Scottish schools finish up pretty soon with a whole bundle of things that she has learnt in primary one. And a lot of that is about those kind of relationships and pretty basic stuff. But would you agree with me that if children aren't all in the same class taught all the same things, they're going to find it out from the other children in the class anyway? So you might as well all get the same information and get a good, responsible education from their teachers.
Quite, and the danger is, of course, if they learn it second-hand. We all know how Chinese whispers that game works, don't we? By the time it's the third child down, the message will have been garbled and lost. So if we're going to teach our children about these ideas of respect, about how to keep them safe, we need to do that in the whole way. Now, I was taught by my parents, of course, that, you know, it didn't matter who you fell in love with. I can remember as a child being sung nursery rhymes about falling in love with different groups of people. That's the kind of family that I grew up in. And I feel very proud to have had parents that have introduced these concepts. And, you know, my sister is a happily married, heterosexual woman. She had these songs taught to her and sung to her when she was young as well. It didn't make me necessarily gay, but it made me comfortable with who I was. But my fear is, and the reality is, let's be honest, parents are loving, but there's no qualification to be a parent. You have some good parents and you have some bad parents. If I had been let to be taught science by my mother, who dropped out of science at GCSE, is a linguist and is an English teacher, but knows absolutely nothing about physics or maths, I would have not been able to go on to do my physics A-level or my chemistry A-levels that I did when I was at school. We understand that parents, of course, are the primary lovers of their children, but they aren't always the best to give a holistic, rounded education, because they also have not experienced all different elements and all different aspects of the world. And people in responsibility, whether it is teachers or whether it is members of Parliament, have a responsibility in these kinds of debates to show leadership. And it was actually the Labour government in 1997 to 2010 that showed leadership. If we had just followed the mob, followed what the opinion polls were saying at the time, it is very likely we wouldn't have made much progress at all on a lot of LGBT rights. We wouldn't have made progress on abolishing Section 28 because Brian Souter was busy ploughing money in to garner, of course, public opinion in one way. Because we as politicians have to recognise public opinion can be whipped up by dangerous forces. And we have a moral responsibility to sometimes make a judgment, not on whether there has been consultation one way or another. This was a totally vacuous argument that had no content to it. But what is the content of the objections? Analyse it and review it, something I'm afraid the honourable member failed to do or articulate in this debate once. Not once did he articulate, actually, the problems with the content of the curriculum.
And in I will do, yeah. My friend, like many members in this debate, is making a very powerful and moving speech. Does he share my concern that actually lots of parents are perfectly satisfied with what is being taught in schools, are perfectly happy that it teaches about respect and about different families, but that if we have the protests of the sort that we've seen, then those parents don't feel able to express that view because they feel intimidated and aren't able to stand up for the things that they'd like their children to be taught about and that children themselves want to be taught about as well.
Lloyd Russell-Moyle. I totally agree, and that is of course even more important that a member of this House, and I would not want to tell anyone how to do their job, but doesn't then go and plonk on one side of that debate without actually analysing, until my honourable friend gave the resources to the honourable member, analysing the content of what was being discussed. It is extremely dangerous to not show that leadership, and I think that is where this debate was wrong from the very beginning. And actually, I think the honourable member has been wrong, deeply wrong, on how he has handled this issue. Pandering to the mob is never right, but it is always easy for an MP to do, and we go in the wrong direction if we do it. Let us remember, of course, one of the instigators of Section 28 was that book, Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, I think it was. Again, a pretty mundane, pretty boring book if you read it, you know. Jenny goes and has an ice cream, Jenny goes and gets a book read by one of her fathers. I mean, it's hardly high literature. But a backlash to that, in a backdrop of rising right-wing tensions in a country... Pardon? I thought you said something, Mr. Speaker. Of course, caused Section 28 to be introduced. Now, I don't think we are on the verge of Section 28 to being introduced now. But if one is not vigilant in bringing people along on that journey... Now, I'll finish on 2 points. One is I think there is a place to bring parents along on this journey, not to consult on whether something should be included in the curriculum or not, but to some extent to make up for the fact that we did have Section 28 for so long, and many parents failed to receive this level of education and understanding. So I think there is a purpose of reaching out into the community. Before I became an MP, I wrote an education resource for the Council of Europe, which was how you talk to educators and children under the age of 10 about sexuality, different families. Now, the Council of Europe is hardly has members of purely progressive countries, Russia, Turkey, Poland. This is a resource that is accessible in all of those countries now, and I'm very proud of that resource that a team of us helped write. But that was because people in the Council of Europe, British ministers actually as well, helped lead a debate in those levels to change attitudes and to be able to run campaigns to also change minds and to educate people. So I do wish that actually we hadn't have really received an apology, because what we heard was a defence of the position that the honourable member made and then some little apology at the end. I wish he'd just been honest about actually having real problems about either the content of this or that he hadn't really decided to take a side one way or another. What we now have is a very disappointing outcome. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.